projects, 4 projects, plus the blue line extension related projects, 3 of those. And so that $32 million of holes had to be filled with over programming. This cycle, we aren't getting a lot of scope change requests that amount to large amounts of money giving back to the region, like maybe we did 10 years ago. But that is a small amount that we do need to over program for. And then the other pieces of that may be projects that drop out. So we do have projects that drop out along the way, and we want to have projects that can either go early or can backfill into those. Really, the one of the biggest variables is kind of right now we're outside of IIJA, so we're in most of the money's in 28 and 29, and that's where we're going to put that over programming. But again, we're outside of the federal funding bill, so there's some unknowns as to what that next federal bill, if anything, will be, or if it would just be continuing resolution. So we do our best guess, given, and MnDOT kind of helps us along the way to kind of predict how much money may be available and which programs are likely to continue. But again, there is some uncertainty there. So that's the first bullet point. Number 2, we did hear from TAB, several members, that they did want to fund those last 2 Safe Routes to School projects. So the previous time we brought this to the group, we funded 8 of those 10 applicants. And so with another $2 million, we're proposing that get added into the scenarios. So the 2 projects, again, one was the Hennepin County project, kind of in the West Metro, Shorewood and Excelsior, and the other one is a City of Arden Hills project. So 10 out of 10 Safe Routes to School projects will be funded. And they did, and there was a general sentiment to put some of the over programming money in bike ped. And so, and once we started doing a little bit of that, one thing we noticed was that we had we were funding several small projects, $1 million or less, with federal funds. So we did, given that TAB direction, we did go back to the chair and the vice chair of the Active Transportation Work Group and said, well, if you do want to fund a few more bike bed projects, especially those small ones that are $1 million or less, doesn't make a lot of sense to federalize those. Would you consider, could we show the 3 additional projects with active transportation dollars? So that's another change on there, where we're showing the 2 new Safe Routes to School projects, and then a third one, which would be a multi-use trail project from Three Rivers Park District. All 3 of those would be funded not with federal funds, but with the active transportation dollars. So the pilot would go from 14 to 17 projects, and not a huge change, but again, the benefit is not federalizing really small projects. Okay, next slide. We did have some requests from TAC, especially at the last TAC meeting, to put the modal funding ranges several places. So we've got it in the PowerPoint, now we've got it in the spreadsheets, et cetera. So this one's showing just a rounded number, $250 million of federal funds available. TAB does set those modal funding ranges before the applications go out. TAB is not obliged to follow that directly, but it does give applicants a general sense for where the money may go. But it's TAB's discretion if they want to go above or below any of the modal funding ranges. Next slide. And the other important point to make, and we heard this from the Active Transportation Work Group, is none of those modal funding ranges include active transportation, the regional sales tax dollars. So that's that money in state legislation is supposed to be above and beyond, and not supplant existing federal funds or other funds for that matter. Same 3 scenarios as we showed you last month here. We tweaked the wording of them, but one of them is closest to the midpoint. The next one would be the safety option. And there's again, kind of four to six projects that are changing kind of at the bottom of those lists. And then the last is the bike ped option. And that shifts about $15 million to bicycle pedestrian. Most of it's coming from transit because we didn't have enough transit projects submitted. And puts us just over the top of the bike ped modal funding range. We did bring to tab about the transit being underneath the modal funding range in two of the scenarios, and didn't get clear direction to add one more transit project. They were kind of, I would say the overwhelming factor was they didn't want to fund to the bottom of those any of the lists, more so than maybe hitting a modal funding range top or bottom. And so we asked them kind of a few times, I'd say, do you want to fund one more transit project? And didn't get clear direction to do so. So at this time, we did not add that in. That was one of the follow-up items we wanted to bring back to this group because we talked about that last time. But still tab could change their mind here next in July too if they want to add that. So again, the active transportation, when you add in those three additional projects that are about $1 million a piece, it gets you up to 18.7 of active transportation. And the total is, upwards of just under $275 million if you add in all the federal funds and active transportation. Next slide there, Robbie. So this is one of the tables that's in the packet, but thought it'd make sense to put into a PowerPoint. So again, here's the modal funding ranges, the midpoints of those ranges, and then how each of the scenarios falls are the three columns on the right side. So closest to the midpoint, and you can see again where we talked about this, the in options 2 and 3, transit falls just below that the bottom end of the modal funding range, which is that 25%. So it's sitting at when we add a little bit more money in there, 24 and change. And again, does not include this chart does not include the active transportation dollars. So next slide. I'm trying to think back if we had this for F&P or TAC. I think maybe Robbie, we first showed this at TAC, the table you had put together, but we did do a table that's in the packet here that looks at the three options and tries to discern what are some technical differences. And that's really one of the tasks for us today, is to look at the pros and cons from a technical perspective on why tab may go one direction or the other. Again, it's only 4 to 6 projects that are different. And so at least from a staff perspective, we didn't see a overwhelming favorite to do to pick one scenario or the next. And we'll come up with some of the pros and cons, but just know we are funding the top projects across all these categories. So you are going to get a lot of the outcomes that I think that ties back to the 2040 TPP and the regional goals. You are going to get projects in more than 50 different cities and townships, investment within those. Two that we point out here, and these aren't the only ones, but the safety option had the highest monetized safety benefits, and the bike ped option 3, funded 2 to 3 additional equity bonus projects, of which there were 49 in this solicitation. Okay, next slide. And so this brings us to the motion. So we got 4 bullet points to the motion, and we'll be going through each of these here today with the leadership of our chair here. So one, they wanted some more technical feedback on over programming. We put in just, somewhere around the 12% or 30 million. We'll talk about if that's the right number or not. So we want some technical feedback there. Pros and cons of each of the scenarios will be a good topic for today. And then you may, if you want, if we kind of can come to some level of consensus, recommend from after your technical review one of the funding options. But again, we put that as optional. So it's not in the last few cycles, we've just forwarded all the options with pros and cons. So it's up to this group if they want to forward a recommendation based on their technical review here today. And then the last part of that is recommending the funding the 17 active transportation projects that are part of, and those 17 projects are in each of the three scenarios. So there's not a difference in either the actual projects or the amounts. It's the same across the board there. Last thing maybe you want to note here, if we can just jump to the tables there, Robbie, on the other attachment. And so one thing we did want to point out in the roadways category, since last time we did receive the HSIP scores, and so we did look across both the regional solicitation and HSIP, and there were several projects that applied for both, which is great. They're trying to get their project funded, and I would say it was almost kind of a wash for the regional solicitation. There was two projects on Highway 47 in the city of St. Francis in Anoka County, and there was they're going to opt to take the regional solicitation money because it yielded them some more money, $7 million, as opposed to they would have had two projects in HSIP, so it was a longer corridor project. Then the flip side, there was a Carver County project and spot mobility and safety here, and would yield them, Carver County, a little bit more money to take the HSIP money. So that's shown as zeroed out. They'll be getting $2 million through HSIP. So like I said, it's kind of a wash from a revenue perspective for the regional solicitation, and but did want to make note of that for a year today. So Mr. Chair, do you want to take any questions, or do you want to talk about kind of maybe or do you want to go into maybe building another scenario, or what's your preference here?
Yeah, no, I think maybe the most important thing to discuss first is just the over programming. I think that's one of the more simple things we can discuss and figure out. I think that will help us build another scenario or add in more projects. He said, 3 more active transportation, which the work group was open to, which I like that idea, and not federalizing those. But yeah, over programming, Steve. So the tab wanted additional technical feedback on that. So do you want to, just from a staff perspective, what are the benefits versus the risks with that 12% over programming or $30 million?
Yeah, so tab gave us a range of, I would say, 5 to 8 million. So that would be somewhere to kind of 30, I'd say 30 to $33 million. Was kind of at least one recommendation that was brought up, and was there kind of a difference between it. And so the risk on either side of that one, and we've had years, and Colleen might be on here too, we've had years where we've given, like last year, we had roughly $2 million and change that we gave back to existing projects that could take more money. So we didn't have enough over programming in that particular year, but other years we've asked project applicants to move back and ask for volunteers if they would move back, and I think that's maybe less likely. But the risk is that either we don't have enough projects, you can't get a brand new federal project going in a short amount of time. So this has been a good strategy for the region to program more, and as projects fall out or get moved back or scope changes occur or new money comes available, one of those 4 things, we've got projects in the hopper that are in the federal process. So that's the good thing. There's always a risk of doing too much, is that you have to ask people to move back with their funding reimbursement. And so, it's okay to do a little bit, but you don't want to keep shifting projects back, and then eventually you're eating into the next future solicitations, essentially. The downfall is you don't have enough projects. We've got money in specific years, and if we don't have enough projects, because there's always things happening, then the risk of having too little over programming isn't really that we'll give it back to TC. It's either MnDOT will use it, or more than likely we'll give it to existing projects that can accept more money, and that's okay to do too. But it's kind of the last priority on our policies, is that we're going back and giving money to existing applicants that can take more money. So that's kind of maybe the two sides of the coin there, and finding the sweet spot in there is never a perfect equation, I don't think, given all these variables I've discussed today.
Yeah, thank you for that, Steve. Yeah, I mean, over programming has always seemed to work out pretty well, and I guess I'd maybe open it to the members if they have any thoughts, pros or cons. And Steve, can you hear me? It looks like some people aren't hearing me clearly.
Yeah, I would agree. You're a little choppy.
Okay. Well, that's not good. Let me check my audio here.
Chair, I think one question I had is when you talked about lower dollar value projects, you cut out, and I was very interested to hear what you had to say about some of the lower dollar value projects and them being federalized. I wasn't sure the point you were making.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I think investing or ticking further down the list for the active transportation project. So the work group where they're running the 14 pilot projects, I think they were open to maybe having 3 additional projects added into that pilot. So that keeps it as, state money, so to speak. And so you're not federalizing those projects essentially through the regional solicitation. You're just keeping them through that active transportation regional sales tax process. Does that clarify it?
Sure. Yes, it does. And when the conversation advances, I do have a follow-up question, but I'll hold on that one.
Okay. Can people hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. Mr. Chair, I have a question for Steve.
Yes, go for it, Innocent.
Yep. With the 30 million possible of programming, did TAB have any opinion on which option or category of project that we should pay more attention to, highway, transit, or bike and pets? Is there a specific one, or is something that we have to make decision on that? We have to kind of make this specific, staff has to make decision on those.
Good. Yeah, Mr. Chair and members, great question. The two scenarios that I'd say were the most prominent we talked about at TAB were the option 2, the safety, and option 3, bike ped. I'd say we didn't hear much. Many people talked about the closest to the midpoint, option 1. So those two were the two they were gravitating towards. They didn't go as far as kind of removing option 1, but I'd say the over programming, the interest, at least on some of it, certainly was to put it towards bike ped projects. Do you agree, Elaine?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
And specifically, several comments were made to fund the 2 safe routes to school projects because it did both bike ped and safety.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Vincent. And then we'll go to Carl Keel, then Carla Stevie after that. Carl? Carl, we're not hearing you. All right, we'll come back to Carl. Carla, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to ask Steve and Elaine, because I was listening to the TAB meeting on my way back from the county engineers conference, and in addition to hearing that they really wanted this consensus building. The other piece that I was hearing over and over was really about safety. So I just wanted to make sure that you had picked up on that as well. I was really hearing that across all the modes and by all tab members. I mean, I saw it in terms of them elevating safety in terms of the scoring, but I was really hearing it again there. So I just wanted to verify that you also picked that up.
I would agree with that statement. Elaine, you too? I see you nodding.
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect, thanks.
Mr. Chair, am I hearable now?
Yes, you are.
So my question is, how much overprogramming would we need to cover all the projects in all the scenarios or the 3 scenarios we put? I just kind of quickly looked. Is it $10 million more or something?
Steve?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think to cover every project in all the scenarios.
The ones that were selected in all the scenarios, yes.
Yeah. I think you would need on order of, well, we put in another, they told us to do another 5 to 8. In the scenario that we're starting to build, we put in another 7. So I think based on what you have here, you need 7 plus another 7 plus another 4. So 16 maybe million. If you want to get every project in every scenario.
Is that including?
So we would be like at
midpoint?
18% overprogrammed, or would we still be under 20% overprogrammed?
We would, yeah. But say you just want to overprogram just, options 2 and 3 were the ones they were most talking about. And I think to get to that, you would need 14 million more of overprogramming. So 25 plus another 14. So you'd be at 39.
So I guess my question would be, is that not unreasonable to consider? It seems like that might be within striking distance.
I think that could, Mr. Chair and members, I think it could be. And that's kind of what we're meant to talk about here today. Yep.
Yeah. And Steve, to add on to that, I mean, there's also some additional set aside, correct, for like unique projects. Looking at, so is there some flexibility there as well, or can you talk on that? And then I see a lot of hands up, then we'll start.
No lack of discussion. Good. Well, thanks, Mr. Chair and members. So, one point to be made too is in the unique projects. Again, that's kind of like the TMOs and the TDM funding. We set aside the money now for future distribution, and so we did set aside $4.5 million in 28 and 29 money for distribution at a later time. The wrinkle in that is that we're in the middle of the regional sustain evaluation, so we don't know if we'll have unique projects in the future or not, or you could use that for some other reason for shorter term projects. But that's another maybe revenue source that's out there that would need some input on if people wanted to use some of that for projects now. But that's kind of the way. Do you want to save some for projects later in 2 years to select, or do you want to use it all now as maybe what you would have to weigh on that $4.5 million?
Okay. We'll go to Colleen, Paul, Nathan, and Elaine.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Steve, I had a recent conversation with somebody from MnDOT who was told by Patrick Wiederman that he wanted that current level of overprogramming tamped down. So I'm not sure if he's had that conversation with you yet, Steve, but I just wanted to bring that up before we get too far along on increasing the amount of overprogramming.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair and Colleen. We have not heard that yet from Patrick from MnDOT Central Office. and maybe it's changed. When we did talk to him a few months ago on that, he told us to manage our program as we see fit, and that there was a closer watch on MnDOT Metro District and how much they could overprogram in the used to be the first year, but the first 2 years. So I guess I haven't heard that from Patrick, if that's changed since our conversation a few months ago.
Right.
But
This was just like within the last week that I've heard this.
okay, well that's maybe a to-do item for council staff then.
All right. Anything else, Colleen?
Nope, that's it. Thank you.
All right. I think it was Cole and Nathan.
Yeah, question. I think it's for Carl, but also Steve to weigh in, because I was tracking your response, Steve, but what I wasn't clear about was whether we were also trying to get all the projects that are in the midpoint scenario, which I think would require more than what you said. So, Carl, were you focused on just accomplishing all the projects in safety in the bike ped scenario, or were you considering the midpoint as well?
Understand what the scope or how large of money we were talking about to fund all the projects. So I had asked the question for all scenarios. Steve had suggested that maybe we limit it to the two that got the most interest from TAB. And I think that's why we kind of said the 14 million. Mine was kind of I didn't have a specific point to my question other to understand the scale of over programming.
Any follow-up, Cole?
Not necessarily. The transit projects are probably the most in question for me. There's some funded in the midpoint, and I think that's something we should discuss too, but that's fine for now. We'll see if that idea goes anywhere first.
Yeah, I think that'll come out in the conversation here today. I know that was a point I think this committee and TAC made as well, as the transit was under the kind of the relative, midpoint of funding scenarios compared to the other modes. So, all right, Nathan.
Thanks, Chair. So I think this question is for Steve or my council staff. So we talked a lot about safety in that scenario, and just looking for a little bit more insight on how the scenario was developed, especially adding extra projects. So I'm going to ask this really carefully because I know there's some sensitivities about this, but is that scenario truly represent adding projects that add the most benefit for safety? Because I hear like, well, it's safe routes to school, they're safe in the name. So is that the most beneficial projects for safety in that scenario? Because when I'm looking at some projects that got added, and I was like curious, like how did they score on safety relative to their category or cross? And like some of them I was like, oh, that one scored a 0. That's kind of odd that it would be in a safety scenario if it scored 0. Or when you're looking at all the categories, like, well, maybe there's a scenario that's actually better than the safe routes, but it's in PED or in a roadway category. So I'm just curious, like how that came up. If like we can truly talk to like performance-based results that like those extra projects added in that scenario represents the highest safety benefit for the region, and making sure like when we're calling it safety, we feel like that is adding the most safety elements in funded projects.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the concept in our heads worked better than maybe it did in practice in building this scenario, because of some of the guardrails that we had from either a modal funding perspective or dollars available and the chunkiness of it. And I would agree with you that maybe the titling of some of our application categories maybe distorts maybe how they scored on safety. If you're in spot mobility and safety or in safe routes to school, it's in the title of the application. So you automatically think, oh, those projects are the safest, which may or may not be true. But when we built that scenario, really the difference was in roadways, because that was one area where we had a very defined, we used the HSIP methodology, a very defined kind of benefit cost analysis. We did hear from TAB members, well, you know, we don't really have a safety measure in transit, but, you know, more people riding transit probably is safer than driving. And so maybe that's another angle to this. But what we did was we flexed it. We looked at kind of what the next best project was within the roadways categories, and use that revenue based on the benefit cost analysis. And that was this Hennepin County kind of Marshall Street project and roadway reconstruction. So that, you know, and kind of looking at what are the next projects on each of those lists, what's the next project down, what was its safety benefit, and that's how we kind of made that last selection of the last project. But from a purist standpoint, you could skip a bunch of projects and get if you want to yield the best safety benefit across these scenarios, then you'd be skipping projects. And that's also something that TAB has said not to do. So that was kind of what we were weighing and building that. Better in concept than maybe in practice when we built it out.
Thank you.
Right. We'll go to Elaine, Carla, and then Darren.
Mine was a comment, was just more of a reminder when, as Steve had mentioned, there has been discussion with the active transportation chairs about adding more funding for the smaller projects, but it has not gone to the work group or TAB yet. So the caveat is if they don't increase it, then we probably would have to fund those projects with federal funding, and that's going to add to the overprogramming.
Okay. Thank you, Elaine. Anything else on that? Okay. All right, Carla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask, I know we're focused on overprogramming, but I know an option would also be using the active transportation, especially for those bike and ped projects. So I'm just wondering if that's something we could talk about. I know that's the committee did not recommend that. So, I mean, either as part of this conversation or as the broader conversation that that the bike and ped projects on the list now would be eligible to apply for that funding in the near future as well. But if we could talk about it as well, kind of a combination of active transportation and overprogramming as part of the solicitation.
Okay, Carla, and just so I understand, so you're talking about for the projects before us right now?
Yes, that's correct. If that's something we could consider.
Yeah, and I think as part of this proposed scenario, Steve, do you want to go over the 3 projects that could potentially be brought on that aren't or haven't been shown that could be additional to move down the list for active transportation? Because that's where maybe we add 3 more pilot projects in with that exact funding that Carla is talking about.
Yeah, sure. Robbie, can you bring up the tables and go to page 7 of that PDF, please? And zoom in maybe a little bit if you can.
We're looking here on multi-use trails and bike facilities.
Yes. Yep. So if you could just zoom in a little bit there so I can. So the 3 projects that we took a look at as we were adding some more money to any of these scenarios that we thought we would hit was this project that's tied for number 10, Three Rivers Park District, for $966,000. And then the last 2 safe routes to school, that was something we heard from TAB. It wasn't interested in funding those. Both those were $1 million projects. One of them in particular is a small, medium-sized city, I'll say, and so it didn't make sense to keep federalizing. If they want to do more projects, we've got kind of 2 sources we can attack. And in this case, we said, well, the really small ones, $1 million or less, maybe let's let's do the active transportation. The chairs thought that was a good idea, but again, like Elaine said, they're gonna run that up the chain here too. So.
Yeah, so it looks like there's potential to use some additional money from that sales tax to get some of these projects off the ground, in addition to the original pilot project. So, does that answer your question, Carla?
That does. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Okay. And then was it Darren next?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Probably a question for Steve, I'm guessing, but just because I'm getting myself all mixed around, the current overprogramming is still around 10% for all three scenarios, right? As currently shown in these charts.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, we haven't added in the additional over programming, that kind of the 5 to 8 million ish. That's not in there in the charts at the moment. You're correct.
Okay, and did you add any project, or you're just flagging potential projects for the active transportation that could be added if you so choose, or TAB so chooses to do?
Yeah, I think they're going to do, Mr. Chair and members, I think they're going to, Safe Routes to School for sure, do those two. And the Three Rivers project, at least in the bike ped one, would be funded either way. So that's, that's another 3 million of revenue, but it doesn't count against the federal over programming. So I think that would be a good thing in getting kind of some consensus here around an option.
Okay, so question may be whether you use this additional active transportation or additional over programming, or both, for the additional projects that may want to be funded.
Yeah, I would start, Mr. Chair and members, I would start with the federal side first. And okay. I think there's just, I'm trying to kind of echo maybe what I heard from the active transportation chair and co-chair, maybe a little hesitancy in going too far in using the active transportation money to balance the books.
Okay, thank you.
But
and then
I'd probably lean on the federal side first, maybe. Understood.
Okay, and one last question on it was on your presentation part, but you had a table showing like the modal ranges and what percent each scenario fell into it. And I think bike ped, the scenario 3, I'll call it, I think the bike ped was outside of the modal, or that range that TAB sets. Was that talked about by TAB at all? Because usually we try not to go beyond their guidelines or ranges.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair and members. Good question. So you're saying in the bike ped heavy scenario, we were just, I think is it just over that 20%?
Yeah, I thought it was 20. I'm going off memory. I thought it was 22 or 23%. Okay. It's above the 20% threshold.
Elaine, any comment from you? I'm trying to remember if we flagged that or didn't. I know we did. There was a slide for TAB that we talked about. Are you okay if we go over the modal funding range, right?
I don't know if they discussed it and it's like, oh, but we always go back to the midpoint. I mean, there was no set direction. I think they're waiting. I think they would like to say, what are the, they're looking at the pros and cons of doing that from the technical level before they kind of weigh in. I don't think they're opposed to doing it, but there was the recognition every time they discuss it, they end up right back in the middle. I mean, last round we did go to the top and just over the bike ped range. So they've done it in the past.
And just for everybody's information, yeah, so bike and ped, the range is 9% to 20%. I think Darren's point is it's over. And then as another point, the trend is under. And I think that point was made to TAB, but that really didn't go anywhere.
Right.
Another conversation we should probably have here today as well.
They did seem to say, don't take it out, don't take projects away from the other categories to increase it.
Yeah.
But that's where they did say add 5 to 8 million as 2 options to add it to the bike ped category as a way to do it. So that was the go ahead, and then said do it to all the scenarios.
Okay, so we need to adopt Carl's motion for over programming and just don't tell MnDOT what we're doing.
Of 5 to 8 5 and 8 million, they wanted those 2 options to look at, which
Yeah.
doesn't give you too much more. But you could probably do that plus add active transportation. So that way and that's not calculated in that funding range.
Yeah, Darren, any follow-up on that?
I think just from, I guess, maybe speaking for Carver County, I guess our thoughts are, we're just acknowledging that it's over. I think we'd have a hard time saying go over program projects specifically in that category on top of going over in addition. So maybe doing what's called the option 2 safety scenario and then over programming projects that'll, I guess, bring consensus with the region would probably be more of our philosophy, I guess, in this discussion.
Okay, so to capture that, so the safety option and then maybe active transportation money for active transportation projects or something general like that.
Just or the additional 5 to 8 million of federal funding and additional over programming.
Okay.
I guess is what I was more suggesting rather than the AT funding, but
okay.
If the additional on top of the current 10% of over programming is needed to build some consensus, I guess the safety alternative with over programming, if it needs to happen in pedestrian trails, whatever it is to be consensus, we'd probably be more in favor of that.
Okay.
That's it. And thank you for your time.
Yep. Thank you. All right, then Jim is Luchar, then we have Carla and then Mike Samuelson.
Mr. Chair, thanks. In relation to that last comment, so help me out, and maybe I just missed it, but is the over programming, that doesn't consider the active transportation funding, correct? The over programming out of the range, in other words?
Mr. Chair and Jim, that is correct. It does not. So when we added that additional $3 million, those 3 projects, that would not count against over programming, correct? Because it's just we're just talking about the federal funds. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yep. And wasn't there some change to allocation? I think, was it a Minneapolis project that was eligible for the active transportation, but Minneapolis said that they would prefer that not be, because they had another project that was, in the pilot, quote unquote, and they didn't want to have more higher representation in the pilot. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members, that's correct. You're gonna have to thank Minneapolis for this one. They would have had, again, we started at those top of the lists and worked our way down to give preference for the non-federal dollars to higher scoring projects. So in doing so, I think that made sense to do it that way. In doing so, Minneapolis would have had 4 projects in the pilot out of what's now 17 projects. So they came back to us after seeing that and said, well, how about, they're still going to get the projects, but they're going to put federal funds on 2 of the 4. So they're going to keep 2 in the pilot. And then they reverted back to federal funds on the other 2. And that allowed us to get 3 additional projects from other partners to be in the active transportation pilot. So thanks.
That wouldn't have, and that wouldn't have a bearing, Mr. Chair, that wouldn't have a bearing on the modal funding range then either. It might, but it's probably, so small it really wouldn't matter, correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members, that wouldn't impact the modal funding range because it was just a swapping of the funding sources.
And I guess my last question, or my last, and maybe we're leading into the cost benefit too much or whatever, but I'll just say that you know, that scenario, the bike ped heavy scenario, does represent the response of survey, multi-agency survey, and application of funding in that scenario, I think. And I'd just like Steve to affirm that.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair and members, so Jim, your question is, does the bike ped option 3 at bike ped represent closest to the survey results?
That's correct.
Yep. Yes, it does. I would say the survey results, people like last time wanted a bigger percent of the budget towards bike ped, largely at the expense of roadways, to tell you the truth. But in this case, because we didn't have enough transit projects, it was much of that increase is coming from transit.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yep. Carla?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I did to also mention, as I was looking at the scenarios, and I can share this in the chat, looking at MnDOT's crash data and the recent crash trends, and it's really showing that since 2019, there has been a steady increase in all roadway users, both fatalities and serious injuries. So like what Nathan was saying earlier, you really want to take a data-driven approach, performance-based results. So just wanted to add that in there that we should be considering what the data is showing us. So it's like a 20 to 25% increase for all roadway users, and then for non-motorized, fatalities have kind of fluctuated, but stayed pretty steady for non-motorized. But for serious injuries, there's been an increase as well for people biking and walking. So just wanted to throw that out there, that there has been an increase in fatal and serious injury crashes for all roadway users. So that's also why I'm leaning towards the option 2, the midpoint safety, and then adding the overprogramming for the bike and ped option to really gain that consensus for the TAB members. So just wanted to put that data out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, next we have Mike.
This comment may not really help us get to an answer, but just something I noticed and want to kind of point out, and maybe it's more for council staff as they go through their current regional solicitation review. But just kind of looking at the 2 scenarios we're talking about the most here, the safety and the bike ped, and kind of what are the projects that are part of one scenario and not part of the other, and just kind of noticing, maybe ironically, that one of the roadway modernization projects that will be funded under the safety is Carver County project, which includes a ped bike grade separation. So good ped bike improvement, but it's funded under safety. And then sort of conversely, you have a similar grade separation on a trunk highway as one of the projects under the bike ped category, the Trunk Highway 149 underpass that's only funded under the bike ped scenario. So I guess what I'm trying to say is these projects are very, very similar. They both include grade separation for ped bike. They're both going to be good for ped bike. They're both going to be good for safety. And at least as we're currently showing them in the scenarios, we're funding one in one scenario and one in the other. And maybe just as we whatever we end up with and goes to TAB, I think maybe just trying to explain some of this nuance to folks, because I think a lot of folks say, well, I want to focus on safety, so let's fund the safety projects, or I want to focus on bike ped, let's fund the bike ped projects. And a lot of times there's overlap on almost all of these projects in terms of the benefits they provide. And so for future rounds, knowing that we often sort of break down our projects in these categories, maybe there's additional nuance we can provide in terms of applications, and use that to help us with some of these questions. Because I feel like a lot of the comments we're getting right now is, well, what are the projects that are really going to be best for safety or ped bike or whatever? And it's difficult for us to answer that right now, just the way things are set up. So not a particular in favor of one or the other. I think, these options are both fairly good and provide a lot of benefits for the region, whichever way we go. But I do think some of that nuance will be helpful as we go forward to TAB and other parts of the council structure.
All right, thank you, Mike. Appreciate those comments. Matt, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I suppose more of a comment, for maybe Steve or council staff. Steve, you made a comment that not enough projects, were applied for in the transit category. I know we've had some discussion about this at TAC as well, but in terms of the two scenarios for safety, bike ped, I guess I'm a little confused that we can say there wasn't enough transit projects applied for in the midpoint that all are recommended for funding. And I know TAB wasn't clear on exactly how to handle the I'll say underfunding of transit in terms of TAB's recommended modal ranges. But I guess I'm wondering is there a scenario that we can at least discuss about adding those transit projects, or at least a transit project, to get us above that modal minimum in either the safety or bike ped scenario? Because like I said, transit is kind of unique in that it's providing safety benefits pretty much to all of its projects. So I guess more just a question to staff if that was considered in looking at some scenarios here.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members, it's a fair question. As I said before, I don't think we got clarity from TAB on this one, and that's why we asked them kind of outright. I said if we were to go back and build this again, kind of seeing the numbers here, we would have put one more transit project in to meet that minimum threshold from kind of a staff perspective. And I'm not sure if they got lost in the broader conversations, which I think it did, but we didn't. I think that's probably what happened. We didn't get a definitive yes or no on it, but not to say that that's not the right course of action either to fund one more of those. So
okay, no, it was helpful to understand kind of how we got here. So
yeah.
I think we even said that we would recommend putting that last transit project in. I think we said that on the TAB slide even. But
yeah, Steve, with just going back to your presentation, you had said Carver County is accepting some money from HSIP instead of under spot mobility and safety. And you said something about it being a wash with something else that happened. So that's not an extra $2 million that could maybe go to one of the transit projects, or can you remind me what you mentioned on that?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I would say when I said it was a wash, meaning that one of the overlapping projects took HSIP and one of them took the solicitation, but it does generate another $2 million that could be used elsewhere. So not a wash from the perspective of how the money is shaking out at the moment, just kind of overall saying that it was a wash. But in this case, it does leave $2 million that you could do something else with. Yes. That Carver County taking the HSIP money.
Okay. Like maybe funding one of the transit projects or getting to the last comment, or finding a way to bring everybody together.
Yeah. The math would work on that. Yes. Yep. It's about the same amount. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess I'm just advocating that we bring I've said this before, bringing the transit category to the minimum to recommend to TAB. I think that's a reasonable option.
Yeah. And then, all right, we have Carla. Are you still up?
Yes, thanks. I have one more just observation on the transit category. In looking through the projects, I did notice that there are several bike and ped projects that support ABRT and LRT partnerships to enhance the transit services, which, it's a partnership. So I didn't hear that come out of the TAB meeting. So I just wanted to make sure that, to share that comment. I know that there were, when I looked through the list, there were at least 5 projects that were supporting the different ABRT, so G line, H line, E line, Network Next, and then Blue Line Extension LRT projects. So there were 5 bike and ped projects that were really there to support the upcoming BLRT and LRT projects. So just wanted to share that observation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Carla. All right, we're gonna go with Scott, Cole, and then Nathan.
Thanks, Chair. This is Scott from Metro Transit. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to basically agree with member Matt Fighton on advocating for somehow finding a way to bring transit to the midpoint level. My understanding is, there were fewer projects submitted for transit than funding was available, and a primary reason why the final project that did not receive funding, I'm looking at the table here, is because there's an interest in just not funding the lowest scoring project, I think is kind of the explanation behind that. And I just wanted to note, I'm not confident there's a definitively what I'll call like bad project in the transit group. So I guess I'm hesitant to accept kind of a blanket statement that says, we just don't want to fund the final project in a category. And so with that, I generally agree with member Matt Fighton to advocate to bring the transit category up to that midpoint, and whatever we can do to try to find that wiggle room to do that, I think is worth considering. I think it'd be a different scenario if scores, were very low throughout the category, or if there was high confidence in the details of the methodology in that application. We're looking at things like ridership projections, emissions reductions that, for better or worse, are often rough estimates submitted by applicants, throughout the categories. So just knowing, the imperfections in how we create these applications, I'm hesitant to deny funding for one simply because it's at the bottom of a pile, and at the bottom of a pile that may not be, quote unquote, objectively bad is all. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Scott. All right, then I think it was Cole, then Nathan.
Yeah, one comment and then one question, I think, for the group, but maybe Steve, if you want to tackle it first. This first comment is I just always like to remind folks that not all the applicants are here, but for the projects that are on the fringe of these scenarios, some of the applicants are and some of the applicants aren't. So I just want to make sure that we all acknowledge that and recognize that particularly Three Rivers is not represented on this group, and they're like 3 of the cusp projects in bike ped. But I also wanted to ask, 2 of those projects are stated as reconstruction. And I don't know if we're getting more of those reconstruction multi-use trail projects, but maybe just a question for the group. Does that at all impact our decision? Because it feels like reconstruction, while it has a lot of benefits for safety, it's not as strong as providing like a new connection, for example. Kind of to Mike Samuelson's point, are they building something new and great that'll really improve safety, or are they just building a bike ped, rebuilding an existing trail? I don't know that really helps because they're kind of towards the top of that list anyways. They'd probably be the priority projects if we add over programming, but kind of a broader question for the group.
All right.
And again, recognizing they're not here either and they can't represent those projects. So put that out there.
Anybody want to jump in and respond to Cole? Well, we can always come back to that, but point taken there.
Well, maybe to put it back on Steve, when you were designing the safety scenario, essentially there were no bike ped projects added from the midpoint. And can you talk through your strategy there? Was it just because we didn't have good numbers, or what was the thinking there?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members. So I guess Cole's first point, most of the trail projects are brand new that we build, although we do get a couple each cycle that are reconstructions, and they're in trailheads and other amenities and making it better certainly too. So there's a mix. So that's probably a good topic for the regional solicitation evaluation, though. I imagine as we have more trails that are coming due for reconstruction. But as far as building out the safety scenarios, I think it was mostly a numbers game. I don't think we looked that deep into the types of projects and said, well, this is a new trail connection or a bridge or an underpass under a busy roadway, therefore we should fund this project or that. Because I think the metrics between the categories were less clear than they were in roadways.
Yeah, so my initial response is, and that's fine, but just to note that I don't like to let what we can measure drive our decision making. And I think that was some of the comments from Tab, that safety can be supported by the bike and ped projects, and we just don't have a great way to measure it. And so that's part of the problem with designing a truly safety focused scenario right now. So I mean, I think it's leaning towards the idea that we should develop some sort of hybrid that merges these two so that we're getting a little bit of the best of both. Though it sounds like we're getting more and more asks to use over programming, and there's got to be an upper limit to that.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Cole. All right, Nathan?
Thank you, Chair. I'll just make a quick comment on Cole's. Is when I made my comment about safety, I think he picked up on that, is there's not really many in bike ped. And even though there's safe routes and there's focus on safe routes, most of these pedestrian projects are adding facilities where they don't exist, or there's nothing ADA, and there's not many other funding sources at all available to applicants right now other than active transportation funding that don't really get to that. And it's really hard to measure safety when people don't even want to walk in places because there's nothing there. So that's more of a commentary building off Cole. The other thing I just want to ask is, we keep talking about midpoint, and I went back in my files. I mean, I've been on this work group the committee since 2016. I don't really recall those numbers moving at all. So I'm just wondering if staff have looked at those averages moving, because if I think about the 22 solicitation, the 20 solicitation, like, are we using static midpoints, or have these actually evolved, and are we not like keeping up with the times of like how demands and surveys and everything have asked us to fund stuff? And if we're trying to move at an old target that's lower, have we artificially created a midpoint problem for ourselves that we are not able to adapt to like where the funding needs want to be? So I just want to make sure like we're confident in our midpoint, and that reflects where funding's been going the last 4 or 5 cycles.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members, great question. So this concept of a modal funding range and midpoints was it during the last regional solicitation evaluation. So that's where we've been using them since 2014, and they were generated based on historic distribution of the funds, which was largely based on where the funding sources were, CMAQ versus SDP versus TAP, TA, TE, all those iterations of bridge improvement and replacement. So some of those funding, so it kind of ties back to historic allocations. The one change we did make was maybe 2 or 3 cycles, Elaine, and that was when we shifted the midpoint, and when we started the ABRT set aside and the new market transit guarantee, we shifted additional money from mostly roadways and a little bit from bike ped to transit. So we upped that midpoint maybe 3 percentage points thereabouts, to 30% being the midpoint for transit. And again, most of it came from roadways, a little bit from bike ped. So when that came into being, I guess that would be like 3 cycles ago. That was when we changed the midpoints of the modal funding ranges last.
that answer your question, Nathan?
Cheryl, I guess I'll ask it more directly, like based upon what we funded in 22, 20, 18, 16, or some iteration, have things moved where the midpoint should have been updated this cycle to reflect where recent history has been at? I'm just my opinion. I don't know how others feel. It's like, if this is going back to stuff to like early noughts of like where we allocated funding, does that truly represent the midpoint in 2024? And where we should be making decisions? Like, is that reflective of today or yesteryear where we may not have been at the same place policy or funding wise?
I could probably answer that question. The answer is probably not. I mean, it's a lot more fluid, and these midpoints are much more static. And I think this really needs to be vetted out through the new regional solicitation process. How do we avoid having what we're doing right now every 2 years? You know, we have a $250 million, and we're just, I know this group, I don't even think we're going to agree on which of these scenarios is going to work. And we're just talking about the fringes. So my comment to staff is, how do we avoid doing this every year or every other, or during the cycle, and have flexibility, but make it easier to gain consensus or using some metrics. So, I think that's the answer, Nathan. Is at least I've been on the committee probably a few more years than you, but yeah, in my time there has been a much more public push for bike and ped, noticeably, especially over the past 5 years, and I don't know much has changed in how we're selecting projects. All right,
so I might just follow up with that on an ask of like, it looks like all the data should be there for Met Council staff to pull, but like, if that represents an average of like 2000 to 2020, like what has been the rolling midpoint average from like 16, or pick a year, the new solicitation 14 to 22, like it should be pretty easy to pick what that average is. It's more of a data point. Like, what is the recent benchmark? Hopefully that's an easier question. I'll let Steve ask if it is relevant.
Yeah, Elaine, you're waiting to jump in, or?
Yeah, I can answer many questions. So prior to this solicitation, there were specific amounts set for each project application type, and the ranges came about so TAB would have some flexibility. And so the midpoint is within that percent. The dollar amounts change as the amount of funding is available. So the midpoint amount changes, even though the midpoint percent doesn't. With that exception, when there was the update with the active, the ABRT range added a large 25 million, and you needed to have some funding available for other transit projects. So typically TAB has gone toward the midpoint, but even within making some changes, the ranges are not consistent across each modal type. So if you want to move a little bit off the funding midpoint of the roadway, so if you take one project out of roadways, you can't do too much with the bike ped because the range is smaller. So there isn't much flexibility with the current ranges to even go too far down onto the bottom of you cannot hit the bottom of the roadway without going over the maximums on the other two. So there is some limitations of what you can do with those ranges. And so it tends to be near the midpoint for roadways because you can't get too far off that midpoint. And I think last one was the first time they actually got up and maybe just a little slight point of a percent over on the bike ped just by moving a project out of roadways. So the flexibility, even though it's there, isn't much flexibility. And I think that has come up with TAB now is how much flexibility we have. And I think it'll come up going into the next, with the evaluation of how much more flexibility should there be? At TAC, there was this discussion is the federal funds have had increased flexibility more than what TAB has set up. So that could be going into this next solicitation, having a bigger discussion of how much more flexible should there be. But again, as TAB has said, oh, we have flexibility, but we still go back to the midpoints and midpoint of the available funding. It's just their nature.
Yeah, maybe to build on that, Mr. Chair. So typically we have the modal funding ranges aren't a rolling average. I think maybe that's what you're requesting is if we included like where we've landed the last few cycles, what would the midpoints be? Which I think would be easy to do because we've been midpoint for the last 5 here, and the last one was bike bed heavy. So it'd be close to the midpoint, a little towards the bike ped. I think that's the conversation is good. I think a lot of it's going to be. I think a lot of this is good stuff for the evaluation. That's going on right now.
Chair, Steve, thanks. And just like recognizing it, TAB wants consensus, and then there's like a dozen rules that all apply to everything. So you're kind of like boxed into all these scenarios and just contextualizing like you're asking for this, but really you can only have like wrinkles of each one unless you want change. But if you've approved the modal range already, your hands are tied. And just understanding like if they're asking you to do the impossible, like there's really only so much that the committees and staff can do to achieve that. And I think that's just adding some context to that is what I'm asking for, because we had a lot of clarity on geographic balance of like all the 0.1% and how that varies. So This was just my attempt to like try to frame up the conversation so they understand that.
Yes. Need some more data? We'll get you some more tables. Yeah.
And I think that comment about geographic balance, that when staff is looking at the scenarios, they start looking at the end where they go. And that kind of ties you in where you end up based on making sure we get some balance. That's TAB has always liked to look at. And that's where all 3 scenarios landed, because that's what you needed to get those projects to get that balance.
All right. Thank you for that comments there, Nathan. Sounds like staff is willing and ready to put more tables together for the next discussion at TAC. All right, we'll go Jim and then Cole.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thanks. Nathan's comment is well taken. I think there was some pretty lengthy discussion at TAC about this prior to the TAB meeting. And I was kind of curious if TAB picked up on that discussion at TAC, because basically the same conclusion was reached by the TAC or some of the TAC members that, hey, you have a desire to move in a direction, but your own modal funding ranges set you up so you can't. And so that's the dilemma that TAB has going forward, I think, is to, how do they want to consider those ranges in the future? Do they want to continue to set those ranges? Do they reflect more of the survey results and so on and so forth? That being said, I think, just a couple things to get back to the safety issue. I think somebody mentioned that, I think Cole mentioned that there's really not a, comparable way to across the board, across categories to compare safety benefits. So, I think that's a difficult, it's difficult, I guess. I understand staff's desire and their need to provide a different scenario, and the idea of, providing a roadway safety, improved scenario. I think vehicular safety, I guess I would say, and as I put in the chat, it is maybe, I commend staff for doing that, coming up with that, but I don't think that you can compare across the board. And I think if you put together as many projects as it would take to, have a similar funding allocation, you may find that there's a larger safety benefit to those projects, but we'll never know that, right? So in evaluating that, I would just, make sure that our group is, noting that in a cautionary way. And then I would also say that there are funding mechanisms for safety projects such as HSIP, which, you know, at least one of these projects is getting exchanged for, that simply trails and, you know, pedestrian ways don't have access to or don't score well enough to be funded in the HSIP program and, you know, maybe some other programs. So that's the end of my comments.
Thank you, Jim. We'll go to Cole, and then I'm gonna try to put the discussion back on track where we can at least agree on a few things here before we continue the conversation. So Cole, why don't you go for it?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Two comments, maybe actually to build on Jim's a little bit. So number one, just wanted to point out that we all recognize that there wasn't enough transit projects to get to the midpoint, and that shifted money to both roadways, primarily to roadways, but some to bike ped. So as a result of that, in both the midpoint and the safety project, we're above the roadway midpoint for the funding levels. And I'll be frank with you, I think Tab's debate is much more about roadways versus bike ped than safety and bike ped. And I think we should send the strong message, like Jim was saying, that both categories, you know, both scenarios present a very great investment in safety for the region. Because I think they're kind of splitting hairs and they're using the safety argument in ways that we can't confidently say it's a safer scenario for the region. And so they should just get that technical feedback and, you know, kind of take that into consideration, but also acknowledging that the safety and the midpoint scenario bring roadways above the midpoint, and roadways clearly in the public surveys were a lower priority than transit and bike ped. And we're unfortunately limited by the number of transit applications we got, but it actually points to a little bit of that idea. If we're going to use over programming to put some in transit, to put some in bike ped, but maybe even take one roadway project away and you know, in this kind of hybrid scenario, and not obviously not a $10 million one, but something that brings them a little bit more into balance as to what the survey results were. And I don't know, Steve, if there were any, you know, there were no scenarios that cut roadway projects from the midpoint. Are there any that maybe had a lower safety benefit under strategic capacity or spot mobility that were towards the bottom that might be able to accomplish getting some more bike ped without having to, you know, double down on over programming?
All right, Cole, which project do you want to remove? Let us know.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the argument, right? Though, like, no one wants to lose a project, but
no.
You know, we're losing a bunch of projects when we're doing this hybrid scenario either way. So,
all right, I'm just gonna jump in here, and then Steve, we'll get back to you.
Yep, go ahead. Yep.
Okay, why don't you say something real quick, and then I'm gonna bring something up here. Go for it, Steve. Why don't you wrap that up?
No, but I was kind of curious if we wanted to maybe show our see if we could either build a hybrid scenario based on the comments here today and what staff has put together, or if you think that's a futile effort here with our time remaining.
No, I don't think it is. I was just going to get to that. So
okay.
What I've heard is I think the committee is open to the proposed over programming, you know, at 12%. You know, Carl even mentioned maybe doing more. On the counterpoint, we heard from Colleen that there may be some push. So unless somebody wants to jump in and say 12% isn't reasonable, I think that's something that we can agree on here today. So it's looking like that is consensus. And then we talked a little bit about the active transportation projects and potentially adding in 3 additional pilot projects, and that would bring more money into bike and ped and also add a variety to the pilot entities, right? Because now we have like a park district, and so I think that could add some value in reviewing how that pilot study goes and is delivered. So is the committee on board with the over programming and then adding a few projects in for active transportation? So I'll just open it up now. Are there any dissenting views on that?
I'd like to add in, that is what Tab wanted you to discuss. Whether to add in more or not.
Right.
Into the bike ped.
Right. And everything I'm hearing is people support bike ped. It seems like a reasonable request to add a few projects, and we're not doubling the size of the pilot. So it seems reasonable to try to pull some consensus together. So I guess I would just ask the committee, is there anybody opposed to those 3 additional pilot projects or the proposed over program? Okay, so Maddie.
Sarah, quick question. I'm not opposing it. That's not why I'm raising my hand, but just a clarifying question. With the way the list of motions is included, if we add those 3 active transportation projects, does that bring our total up to 17 or does that bring our total up to 20?
17.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, from 14 to 17, yeah.
Okay, so I think we don't have to make a motion or do anything, but I think we have some consensus on those 2 points. Now, to get to your scenario building, Steve, I think we do. If there's a way you could pull up a spreadsheet and maybe show how the over programming in the active transportation additional pilot and kind of where that goes on the list.
Okay.
We have a little time here, so maybe we should at least try to put something together to help TAC and TAB with their analysis. But I don't recommend removing a project unless Cole puts his name to that one.
Hey, Chair, would another low-hanging fruit be is reallocating that 2 million that got moved from HSIP? It seems like that's unknown right now, and it didn't seem like that was accounted for.
Yeah, and yeah, so that we did. Yeah, thank you, Nathan. We did talk about that, and I think maybe as Steve, as you look at a hybrid or additional scenario, where could that money go? There's a lot of discussion continuing on transit is under the range, and how do we maybe get one, maybe not both, but maybe one of those projects? And so how can we best get consensus? So Steve, maybe I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Yeah, so and talking to the chair before the meeting, we had planned to try and build something with you all together in the meeting, but given the math and the parameters, we thought, well, let's put something on the table and then you can react to it and we can tweak it. Let's put something out there that works. So what we did here was, again, these last 2 safe routes, this is in multi-use trails. These last 2 safe routes to school projects we funded with active transportation. So no hit against the over programming from those 2 projects. Again, here's the mixture hybrid scenario we put together. So we funded all of the projects that were in the existing bike ped scenario 3 plus 2 safe routes to school. And not that this is where it has to end, but so we put all that over programming right here, and that essentially gets you every project in option 3 plus the 2 safe routes to school, and that's an additional 7 million over programming. Currently, we didn't. This is now in the transit. We didn't fund. I think the next one we would, if we were to fund one, it would be this transit modernization project for $2.1 million. We didn't show that funded in the hybrid, but I've heard several people today say, well, maybe that's a good idea in either options 2, 3, and or a hybrid approach. And in roadways, again, the consensus was, or what I heard from TAB was, they were interested in this, both the safety and the bike ped options 2 and 3. We're close on the safety scenario and getting all the safety projects in roadways, which I think is what several TAB members liked, with the exception of this last Hennepin County roadway reconstruction project. And we're not too far away from that because we're got a little bit more over programming. We could do to 12%. There's a little bit in that unique projects category if you wanted to, and we're not too far away, I guess, from funding every project in safety and in bike ped, if that was a goal to try and get there for some level of consensus. So that's the hybrid we have have today. It's not, the math does work out, and we've got maybe a little bit more over programming we could put on there if people so choose. So that's what we put together here, Mr. Chair, with you. And
yeah, and can you show the bike and ped and just again the active transportation, the additional, okay, there, and then two in and the last two were.
Yeah, so this gets you to the same level as the bike ped heavy scenario was before, option number 3.
Yep.
And where the addition same for here, and where the additions come are the 2 safe routes to school projects at the bottom across all the scenarios, but in this hybrid option.
Okay, so that's the Hennepin County and Arden Hills projects get funded in the hybrid, and they weren't before, even in the ped heavy.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, so let me throw something out there. So it seems like we're doing a lot of good things here.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense. I mean, something like this, if you're trying to pull policymakers together, I like the idea just because the modal guidelines are set. We're under on transit. It may make sense for that Carver County project that took each to maybe to earmark that or have TAB consider maybe funding a transit project with that money. But then you got these kind of Hennepin County under the, was it the reconstruction you said?
Yeah, it was a roadway reconstruction project. And
yeah, well, and maybe to help accomplish that under their safety, under the safety scenario, I mean, could that be a combination of additional over programming and or unique project funding? So, I would be open to something like that. And I think we're getting close, but I
think so. Yeah.
Anything else before we open this up for discussion, Steve?
No, I don't think so. No.
All right, Cole.
So this is kind of my point, Michael, about picking winners and losers like you asked me to do so eloquently. In this scenario that we're developing, we're saying the safety projects all get funded, but only some of the bike ped scenario projects get funded. We could do a hybrid of both. Well, sorry, you have the Hennepin County one in yours, but what was kind of talked about was funding the whole safety and only adding over programming to the bike ped. What TAB actually asked for was adding over programming to both scenarios, in which you'd even go further down the bike ped list. So I do think a compromise is taking a bits of both scenarios to come up with the hybrid. I was curious, Steve, was there any conversation about, and this is probably a regional balance question, about the Hennepin County versus the last Washington County project that was under spot mobility? It's not as much money, but that could be another project that you shift to bike ped under the hybrid.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr. Chair, members. So that's certainly an option. I will say for this regional solicitations funding cycle in particular, and maybe the last several cycles, I'd say Washington County was the lowest relative to their population. So a little bit, we're reaching a little bit down to that project because of the geographic balance lens, I would say, more than anything. But lots of ways to look at this stuff.
All right. Anything else, Cole?
No, I think that's just helpful to know that that's really a regional balance, which is important, and TAB cares about that. So that's good to know.
Yeah, perfect. All right. We'll go Carla and then Carl.
My concern about the hybrid approach, Steve, is that the project that is not showing up, the Marshall Street project, is the one that was added for the safety scenario because of the safety benefit of the project. So that's my only concern, is you're actually taking away the project that you added for the safety scenario. So I would have a tough time supporting that in terms of the safety benefits. So if we can find a way to to keep that one on the list for the safety, if we're going to truly say this is a safety scenario that we're advocating for. That was my only comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla.
Yeah, sir. I'm just trying to, so if I were to repeat what you said, the reason it was the safety category is because of the one project, but then we're, as we kind of mix this together, then we're losing that one project that was added specifically for the safety benefit of it, right?
Right.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Thank you.
Okay.
Right. And it was shown, so it's tougher to take away, even though it was in an option. I think this gets back to Carl's original point. Let's fund them all. So yeah, can we overprogram or take money from unique projects to get that funded? Because I think politically that is probably tough to now take away it in a hybrid proposal. But Carl, Carly, do you have anything to follow up on that before I go to Carl?
No, I don't have anything additional. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, Carl. All right, Carl, your mic isn't working again. You can hear me. We'll give you a minute to try to figure it out.
Now is it working?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry, I'm having some issues here. Anyhow, I would propose that we offer CAB another alternative, which is what we're kind of calling the hybrid one, which would be the full safety one and the full bike ped options. So it would include that Marshall Avenue one, and just tell them what is the over programming associated with that. I don't think it's going to be all that terribly high.
Yeah, Steve, do you make that calculation right now? I mean, instead of 12%, is it 15% or?
Yeah, I think we need roughly another, I think it'd be right around that 15%, give or take. Yep. I think you're good math there.
Yep. All right, well, if we make that proposal, I think it does a lot of different things. And then if you're funding one transit project out of the, the available, like the $22 million that came up because of the HSIP swap, I think we're getting closer. So, Carl, anything else on that? Great comment. Give them just a second, and we'll go to Scott after this.
Hi, Chair. Are you calling on me, Scott?
Yeah, Scott, why don't you jump in? I can't hear Carl if he has anything else to say. Yes, go for it, Scott.
Just a real quick confirmation. So for the transit category, the add in play here would be the money shifting out the money shifting into HSIP, and that $2 million would transfer over to a transit project. Is that how transit interacts with this?
Yeah.
Balance of decisions. Okay.
That's what I'm just throwing out there as idea. Yes, that's an idea. Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I understood. Thank you.
All right. So we have no other speakers at this point.
So I do have one question, Mr. Chair. I think for Steve.
Yep.
You had mentioned the unique projects, which is $4.5 million, correct?
That's the set aside. Yeah.
So we don't have a whole lot of experience with those projects, obviously, but what are your thoughts on the regional solicitation evaluation, its need to assess whether we have them, and what might happen if we put that into over programming and then we need to add money back into unique projects, 2 years from now? How would you see that scenario potentially playing out?
Yeah, I would. You could still, you could still have a unique projects category. The money would be available later. And that's one of the benefits right now is it's closer money for unique projects, but there either would be a delay. They could still do the projects earlier. The money would be available later. And it's probably something less than the 4.5 million because that also includes the regional model in there. So it's, probably more on the order of probably 3 to 3.5 million that would be set aside for unique projects, or that is set aside for unique projects in there.
So I wonder, Mr. Chair, if we could add that as a note, a kind of an addendum to you guys' motion that TAB should consider if they want to reduce over programming, just pulling from future unique projects rather than trying to cut projects that we've already agreed kind of accomplish all their goals. Because I think number one, a lot of TAB members don't even like the unique projects category. Number two, there is flexibility to still do it. It might just change the parameters of it when we do the next solicitation. So I think that would be an option maybe for us to say you should consider dipping into that pot if you want to reduce over programming, because you have 4.5 million there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I saw somebody put something in the chat. So Carlos said, can we add more active transportation funding to keep the over programming closer to 12%? I guess we could recommend anything, but I think the working group, active transportation working group, was reticent to even adding any pilot projects, right? But then Steve, I think after the last TAB meeting, you had a discussion with the chair, and I think there's an openness to maybe adding a very limited scope in. So I guess I would have you answer that question.
Yep, I would agree with you. I think the scale of that would have to be pretty limited, and for a direct purpose. And maybe this is one.
Yeah. So could we show a hybrid approach? So this would go to TAC and then TAB. Is that correct, Steve?
Correct. Yeah.
Could we show the hybrid approach with everything we talked about, and then just put some of those notes in there, the over programming?
Mm-hmm.
And because I think if we do recommend a hybrid approach that shows all these projects, I think it's going to be harder for TAC or TAB to take those away.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we have consensus that we want to fund the most projects possible, I think we show it that way. And if they want to take away over programming, or they're not comfortable with that, well, then they can have that policy discussion. So Nathan?
Yeah, just seeking clarification from staff coming out of TAB. I know there's been talk of safe routes, but looking at some of the scores and getting more projects to Chair's point, was there any talk about like funding more pedestrian versus bikeway projects? Just like the bikeway projects, I think Cole brought this up, is like some are just really big ticket items. And then if you look at PED, some of our scoring really well in safety, as well as getting a little bit more geographic balance as a part of the scenario.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair and members, there's a few people that have talked about the mix within bike ped and changing that mix, and I think that would be TAB's discretion in July if they wanted to change the project mix to do more pedestrian, trail, or safe routes to school. But I don't think there was consensus other than to fund those last two safe routes to school projects. So to date.
Thanks, Steve. Scott?
So, Mr. Chair, I wonder if we want to go back to the motion, requested motion from staff, and see if we can get somewhere on that. Just because this is an action item, and we do have one more action item here today.
Yeah, could we go back to the PowerPoint with the recommended motion? So again, while that's getting pulled up, it's recommends over programming near the 30 million or 12%. talk about pros and cons of the options. I think staff can capture a lot of that, and maybe that we came up with a hybrid option, and then recommends funding the 17 active transportation projects. So staff would prefer a motion, a singular motion to cover all 4 of these items, I assume, or a motion could look like we support the over programming, the 17 AT projects, and to further show the hybrid as an additional option that helps fund more projects for the region.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, so you're saying, what I think I hear you're saying is there wouldn't be a specific recommendation to fund one of these options, but it would be to show a hybrid option to TAC in this case for their consideration. Is that where you're going?
Yeah, and they can figure out whether hybrid is better than any other, but yeah, so the hybrid, just to summarize, I think what we've discussed is it shows all the additional projects, the additional active transportation. It includes the Hennepin County project under safety, with notes that, you know, additional over programming would be required, but it shows all the projects that we just went through, and it funds the most projects out of all of the different scenarios.
I think we would need to kind of run the numbers on that too, and then we'll bring back what we find back to TAC, and so then people can have a chance to review it in the packet, and, you know, let us know, let their committee members know if they like it or don't like it. But I think then they'd have a chance to kind of see it in more detail.
Yeah, so it's not, it's just showing it as an option.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so Cole, did you have something final?
Well, I feel like, and I you know, I haven't asked everyone in the group obviously, but I feel like this group might be willing to go a step further, because part of the problem with that suggestion is that you could have the same amount of over programming in the other 2 scenarios and add even more safety or bike ped projects. And so I feel like what we should be saying and we're recommending is that we use over programming to accomplish all the projects in the safety and bike ped scenarios. And that should be our recommendation. And then we might have some of those additional thoughts about active transportation or unique projects being used to supplement over programming. But I really feel like what you're suggesting is recommending a scenario, not an option, because that option is not equivalent to the other options and the amount of money we're assuming. And so if like, I don't know, I mean, I kind of thought the group was just saying, let's just recommend that to TAB because it really solves all their problems. And basically we're saying we're comfortable with the level of over programming that would be assumed there.
Yeah, I mean, it can be brought forward any way. You know, I don't know if we need an official motion. I think staff captured a lot of the discussion here today, but yeah, I agree. Can show in a lot of different ways.
I mean, I can take a stab at it. I think
with MnDOT Metro District. Steve, were we going to present the list?
Yes, we can. Robbie can pull that up for you here on the screen.
So in this cycle of regional HSIP, we received 54 applications from the cities. Of the 54, active and 11 reactive, recommended lead for about 31 million cycle in 28 and 29. MnDOT had 12 and the cities had 4 projects. And approximately 2/3 have a significant bike and ped portion to the projects that were submitted, including bump outs and RRFBs, medians, and other bike focused portions of the project. When you take a look at the list, there's a wide variety of projects that were funded: cable medians, RFBs, bump out I guess I'm open for any questions if anyone has any questions regarding the list of projects.
All right. Doesn't look like we have any hands up at this point. So, do we have a quorum, Bobby?
We have 14 members that have returned, so we do have a quorum.
Okay. So this item needs a motion to approve the attached 20 projects running through HSIP and inclusion at 26 to 29. So we need a motion and a second.
Elaine Kusuka will make a motion.
Darren Melky, I'll second.
All right, thank you, Darren. So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All right, it looks like none. We'll go ahead and vote by roll call. Robbie?
Chair. Anoka County OJ. Carver County Miyake.
Aye.
Hennepin County Stevie.
Aye.
Scott County Jessen.
Aye.
Washington County Dahlheimer.
Aye.
Leamington Keel. Eden Prairie. Ridley Coast.
Aye.
Lakeville Omi. Minneapolis Coster.
Aye.
Plymouth Thompson.
Aye.
St. Paul Weber.
Aye.
Metro Transit Genowiak.
Aye.
Urban Transit Fighton. DNR Spooner Walsh. MnDOT Bike Samuelson. MnDOT Metro District Tag or Car.
Aye.
MnDOT State Aid Brown.
Aye.
MPCA AO. Met Council MTS Hinneker.
Aye.
Hub Coordinator Kutsukos. Lane, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. You can type your. Oh, thank you. Okay, Chair, the ayes have it. 13 ayes. Motion passes.
All right, thank you, Robbie.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any other information or business items from committee members? All right, seeing none, I just want to thank the committee. I thought it was a really good discussion today. Hopefully that additional option will provide food for thought as it moves forward. And again, appreciate all of your work and effort, and we are adjourned. Thank you.